Tilbury Fort, also known historically as the Hermitage Bulwark and the West Tilbury Blockhouse, is an artillery fort on the north bank of the River Thames in England. The earliest version of the fort, comprising a small blockhouse with artillery covering the river, was constructed by King Henry VIII to protect London against attack from France as part of his device programme. It was reinforced during the 1588 Spanish Armada invasion scare, after which it was reinforced with earthwork bastion, and parliamentary forces used it to help secure the capital during the English Civil War of the 1640s. Following naval raids during the Anglo-Dutch Wars, the fort was enlarged by Sir Bernard de Gaume from 1670 onwards to form a star-shaped defensive work with angular bastions, water-filled moats and 2 lines of guns facing onto the river. In addition to protecting the Thames, in the 18th century Tilbury also began to be used as a transit depot and for storing gunpowder. It continued to be essential for the defence of the capital, and a new artillery battery was added in the southeast corner during the Napoleonic Wars. From the south, the fort is entered through the Watergate. This 2-storied gatehouse dates from the late 17th century with a monumental stone facade featuring carved displays of classical and 17th century weapons. When first built, the now empty niche at the front probably held a statue of King Charles II. The building originally acted as a house for the master gunner. The first permanent fortification at Tilbury was built as a consequence of international tensions between England, France and the Holy Roman Empire in the final years of the reign of King Henry VIII. Traditionally, the Crown had left coastal defences to the local lords and communities, only taking a modest role in building and maintaining fortifications. And while France and the Empire remained in conflict with one another, maritime raids were common, but an actual invasion of England seemed unlikely. Most of the inside of the fort is taken up by the parade ground, an area covering 2.5 acres. The central parade ground was raised to its current height in the 17th and 19th centuries using chalk and dirt, and by the early 20th century much of it was occupied by 4 large warehouses, since destroyed. Just to the west of the Watergate is the fort's guardhouse and chapel, dating from the late 17th century and one of the oldest surviving places of worship within a British artillery fortress. The living conditions at the fort were poor. It was surrounded by marshes with a poor road network, and the garrison had to survive on collected rainwater. A trader called a sutler built a house inside the southern entrance, growing vegetables within the southwest bastion and enjoying an effective monopoly on selling food to the soldiers. The River Thames was strategically important, as the City of London and the newly constructed royal dockyards of Deptford and Woolwich were vulnerable to seaborne attacks arriving up the estuary, which was a major maritime route carrying 80% of England's exports. At the mouth of the estuary, the Thames narrowed considerably, forming a natural hub for communications. The long ferry took passengers into the capital, and the cross ferry moved traffic across the river. This was also the first point that an invasion force would be able to easily disembark along the Thames, as before this point the mudflats along the sides of the estuary would have made landings difficult. Temporary defences had been constructed at Tilbury as early as the 14th and 15th centuries, although little is known about their design. Under the King's new programme of work, the Thames was protected with a mutually reinforcing network of blockhouses at Gravesend, Milton and Higham on the south side of the river, and the West and East Tilbury on the opposite bank. West Tilbury Blockhouse, part of the Inner Line, was initially called the Hermitage Bulwark because it was on the site of a hermitage dissolved by the King in 1536. It was designed by James Needham and Christopher Morris, supported by 3 overseers. Prior to the work, the estimated cost had been given as £211, allowing for stone, timber, 150,000 bricks and 200 tons of chalk. The D-shaped blockhouse was curved at the front, with 2 stories of gun ports, and probably had additional gun platforms stretching along the river on either side of it. Ancillary buildings were placed at the rear, and the whole site was protected by a rampart and a ditch, with extensive marshlands and creeks giving additional protection to the east. It was initially commanded by Captain Francis Grant and his deputy, and garrisoned with a porter, 2 soldiers and 4 gunners, equipped with up to 5 artillery pieces, including a demi-cannon and sakers. The invasion threat passed, and in 1553 all of the blockhouses were ordered to return their guns. Milton and Higham were demolished. In the summer of 1588, however, threat of invasion by the Spanish Armada. An army was mobilised to protect the mouth of the estuary, and emergency improvements to the fortifications at Tilbury Blockhouse were made by Robert Dudley, the Earl of Leicester. Queen Elizabeth I visited the fort by barge on the 8th of August 1588 and rode in procession to the nearby army camp, where she gave a speech to the assembled forces. Fears of invasion continued even after the defeat of the Armada, and over the course of the next year the Italian engineer Federico Ghiambelli reinforced the blockhouse with probably 2 concentric earthwork ramparts with ditches and a palisade. A boom was stretched across the river to Gravesend at a cost of £305. I think we're roughly halfway round, getting a bit peckish, so I've only gone and bought a little USMRE with me for something to snack on. This one's a little bit different. This is a hot weather pack, so it says more assortment 1. So I guess the hot weather ones are just kind of like a couple of drinks and snacks that you could add along with a normal MRE if you was, a soldier or whatever it is you're doing that's outdoors and physically exerting. And yeah, it's just designed just to keep you hydrated, I guess, replace some salts and minerals that you lose through sweating. It is pretty warm today. There is a breeze, so apologies if there's any wind disturbance whilst we're doing this little review. So I got this one on eBay for, I think it was about 10 quid. And I mean, yeah, it's not a lot in it, so that is a bit pricey for what it is, but these are quite hard to come by, so I saw it and I thought I've got to get it just to try it. So it tells you what we've got inside. We've got a caffeine or caffeinated chocolate pudding, which I think is kind of like an Angel Delight, dried cranberries, an energy gel, lemon, lime or orange flavour. We've got cheddar filled snack pretzels, and I think that's like a carbohydrate and electrolyte beverage powder. It says we've got 2 of them. Let's just get in and see what we've got. And so that is our chocolate pudding. So you don't have to cook any of this stuff, that's one of the advantages of it. Can't really crack a stove out here anyway. And it's got like a little nozzle there, so you could literally just eat straight from the pouch. Then next thing we have is a lemon lime beverage powder, no fruit juice, so that's I suppose one of our, it's beverage powder anyway. Then this is it, this is our carbohydrate electrolyte beverage powder, orange flavour, so plenty of drinks, that's good. Then some cheddar cheese pretzels, I think we've had these before, they're not bad. There we go, that's our lemon lime flavour energy gel. Could be a bit hit or miss, that could be horrible, could be really nice. Osmotic cranberries, which is another word for dried cranberries, really. There we go. So yeah, that is everything in the pack. So you know what I'm going to say, enough yakking, let's get snacking. Okay, we're going to have a look at the cheddar cheese pretzels first, as nominated by Candice. Someone in the comments, an American subscriber I think, said they're called combos or something. Yeah, there we go, that's what they look like. They're pretty good, salty, so you know, you're replacing, like I say, salts and minerals again from sweating. Yeah, they're not too bad really. They remind me of like tuck biscuits that you get in this country, in England. Okay, next up we're going to have the carbohydrate electrolyte beverage powder, orange flavour. I made a mistake earlier, they're both carb electrolyte beverage powders. That's lemon and lime. So we'll mix it up in the, we'll mix it up in the bag. That'll be fine. Apologies about the shadow here at the moment, because we're just trying to sort of get out of the wind, out of the sun. So the sun's behind us at the moment. It's been really warm all weekend.
Still got warm though.
It is, it's baking. My back's burning. Okay, I'll probably put a bit more water in than I should have done. I'll try and remember how Steve does it now. He's like that, isn't he? Yeah, it's definitely orange. It's a very bright, artificial orange colour. That's nice. And it's definitely not like your normal kind of drinks they do in this. You can tell it's like carbohydrate, and so it's got like a thickness to it, like almost quite filling. Very strong flavour. Right, next thing we're going to have is the lemon lime energy gel. Don't know what this is going to be like. Oh, okay, right, it's quite runny, so I can't pour a lot of it out. Okay, let's pour some of this out. Oh, it's sort of, maybe I should have mixed it up a bit more first. Oh, there's a lot of like water coming off of it, and then it's literally like jelly. There we go. Oh, it's very thick. It's got a very artificial taste to it. I don't know. I mean, I don't know if I've mixed it up right, or I don't know, but it got. You can tell it's got like a lot of
shit.
Yeah, shit in it, but like like sugars and like carbohydrate sort of stuff, and like potassium in it. Just a lot of carbs, but yeah, it's very thick sort of tasting. There we go. Tastes like there's little bits in it as well. Yeah, I'll tell you what we'll do, let's just open the pouch up. Literally like jelly. There we go. You can try a bit of this. It's not bad, I can eat it, but it's the weakest component for me at the moment so far out of the pack. But
don't look very nice though, does it?
yeah, it's quite tasty. Try a bit. Right, next thing we're going to have is the osmotic cranberries, or the dried cranberries. There we go, they look pretty fresh. Try and get it to focus on them. There we go. They're pretty good. You know what you could do? You could mix those in with the chocolate pudding if you wanted. I mean, we're not going to do that today because we ain't got a tray or stuff like that. It's just snacks we're having, but it's an option. They're nice. I mean, they're full of flavour, chewy. They look pretty good quality. Yeah, I'm impressed by them. Okay, next thing to try out is the carbohydrate electrolyte powder, lemon and lime flavour. It's not a bad little pack, this really, just a few good snacks. Great for like a, you know, if you're doing a day walk, or if you're somewhere where you can't have a fire or anything, and just, you know, you just want a few little snacks. Like it's all right for this, because I can't exactly crack like a stove out and stuff here in the middle of a full parade ground. So right, there we go. It's like a nice bright green colour again. Okay, so that's the lemon and lime one all mixed up, and yeah, I mean, it's not too dissimilar from the ones we've had before. Can't really pick which is my favourite one at the moment out of the two, the orange or this one. Candy says this is the better one of the two. They're both sort of thick tasting. Yeah, I mean, probably this one is slightly better of the two, but for me it's about even Stevens. I like both of them. Yeah, I just wish we had more of them. I don't know if I'd want it any weaker though. If I filled it up more, that probably wouldn't taste as good then. I think it's better sort of a slightly more concentrated taste. I think we've got one more thing to look at, which is the caffeinated chocolate pudding, and that'll be this little ration pack done with. So I'll show you this now. But like I say, I don't think you need to heat this up at all. You just have it cold. So sort of give it a little bit of a knead, just in case it needs maybe mixing up a little bit if it's separated. Don't think it has though. Alright, Steve never says this. Let's get this out onto a spoon. Oh, there we go. That's quite thick actually. That looks pretty good. Got something extra in it, it looks like, other than caffeine. I'm trying to get it to focus because of the sun and the shadows. It's about the best we can do. Let's try it. That's really good. It's got a bit of an artificial taste to it, but it's nice. Yeah, it's just like Angel Delight, or yeah, chocolate mousse really. Decent stuff. This could be the best bit of the ration pack other than those cranberries. Though I think it's all been good, there's not really been a bad thing. I mean, the gel was a bit iffy, but apart from that it's all been a winner really. That is really good, quite thick. That has been a US More Hot Weather Assortment 1 ration pack. Really good, something different. And we'll crack on with exploring the rest of the fort. Okay, one final thing before we carry on with the rest of the fort. We've got a little cider to share as it's such a nice day. So Recorderlig Botanicals, rhubarb lemon mint, 4%. So it's only a little bottle, so we'll share this one together. Oh, it smells so nice. I think we had this one before actually at Coal House Fort. And I reckon this is worthy of an 8.75 out of 10. And a little bit. Straight in there. Good, innit? 8.75. Cheers. In the early 1600s, England was at peace with France and Spain, and as a result the coastal defences received little attention. Surveys reported multiple problems with Tilbury Fort, including flooding caused by the estuary tides, and ferry passengers and animals making their way uninvited into the fort. In 1642, civil war broke out between the supporters of King Charles I and those of Parliament. Tilbury was controlled by Parliament, who placed the Tilbury and Gravesend forts under the command of a military governor, using them to control traffic entering London and to search for spies. It saw no military action during the war. After Charles II was restored to the throne in 1660, he began a wide-ranging programme of work on the coastal defences. The Dutch fleet then attacked up the Thames in June 1667, but were deterred from going further for the fear of the Tilbury and Gravesend fortifications. In reality, the forts were poorly prepared to resist a Dutch attack. At Tilbury, there were only 2 guns ready for action. The Dutch struck the English fleet at Medway instead, giving enough time for the government to improve the defences along the Thames and mount 80 guns on the forts. In the wake of the conflict, the King instructed his chief engineer, a Dutchman named Sir Bernard de Gaume, to develop Tilbury Fort's defences further. The total cost of the project is unknown, but was significantly more than the original estimate of £47,000. The result was a large 5-sided star-shaped fort with 4 angular bastions, revetted in brick, with an outer curtain of defences, including 2 moats and a redoubt. 2 new gatehouses defended the entrance from the north. 2 gun lines of gun platforms facing the river stretched alongside either the side of the fort. The interior of the fort was raised up above the level of the marshes to prevent flooding, and barracks and other buildings were constructed inside. Past the northwest bastion, the soldiers' barracks would have stood opposite those of the officers, but was destroyed after the war, and only the foundations of the building remain. New barracks for the officers and enlisted men were rebuilt in 1772, but the officers often preferred to live across the river in the more urban setting of Gravesend, near the military headquarters there. A cricket match in 1776 between men from the Kentish and Essex sides of the Thames reportedly ended in bloodshed when guns were seized from the guardroom. Newspapers recounted how an Essex man and a sergeant were shot dead, and a soldier was bayoneted before both sides fled the scene. It is uncertain how accurate the newspaper account was, although the historians Andrew Saunders and Charles Kiteley give it some credence. The Landport Gate lies behind the magazines and has a gatehouse called the Dead House above the passageway leading into the interior of the fort. Facing the parade ground are the officers' quarters, a terrace of houses probably dating in its current form to the late 18th century, with the stables at the northern end, originally used to hold the commandant's horses. It now holds the Bernard Truss collection of military memorabilia. The northeast bastion was redesigned after 1868 and contains an earth-covered magazine as well as emplacements for 9-inch rifled muzzle-loading guns. On the north side of the parade are two early 18th century magazines, altered in the 19th century. These were specially designed to avoid the use of iron, which might have generated sparks and set off an explosion, instead being built using wood and copper. They are the only remaining examples of their type in Britain. By the start of the 18th century, Tilbury Fort was one of the most powerful in Britain. The number of artillery guns varied. In 1715 there were 17 demi-cannon and 26 culverins mounted on the west gun platform, and 31 demi-cannons and 1 culverin on the east. The following year there were reported to be 161 guns in total at the fort, although 92 of these were in poor repair and inoperable. In addition to its role in protecting the Thames, the fort had various military uses during the 18th century. From 1716 onwards, the Board of Ordnance began to use it as a gunpowder depot. There were safety restrictions on moving gunpowder in and out of the London docks, so Tilbury was used instead. 2 large magazines were built, able to hold 3,600 barrels of powder each, and the old blockhouse and other buildings were converted to act as further magazines. Eventually, the fort could hold more than 19,000 barrels of gunpowder. It was also used as a transit depot for soldiers, and after the Jacobite Rising of 1745, as a prison to hold 268 Highlander prisoners of war. The Jacobite prisoners were kept in the gunpowder magazines, and 45 died from typhus before they were sent on to London for trial. During the American Revolutionary War, there were fears of a French attack on London. In 1780, the army carried out a practice attack on the fort with 5,000 soldiers, but there were less than 60 guns left at the fort, and many of these were in poor condition. Thomas Hyde Page inspected Tilbury in 1788 and reported that the defences facing the Thames were seriously inadequate. As a consequence, a new battery was built in the southeast corner of the defences, armed with 32 pounders pointing downriver, and a new battery, New Tavern Fort, was built along the river to the east. Fears continued during the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars, and smaller batteries were constructed further up the river in 1794. Tilbury continued to be an essential part of the capital's defences because of its control of the crossing point on the Thames, and the guns were upgraded with new traversing platforms. The Gravesend Volunteer Artillery was formed to man the forts on both sides of the river. During the invasion scare of 1803, the Royal Trinity House Volunteer Artillery manned 10 armed hulks, placed across the river as a barrier at Tilbury. By the 1850s, the advent of steamships meant that enemy vessels could sail up the Thames far more quickly than before, reducing the time available for forts to intercept them. Rifled guns and turret-mounted weapons and new armour plating meant that enemy warships could fire on forts such as Tilbury from downstream more easily while being protected from their guns. Fears of a potential invasion by Napoleon III of France led to the establishment Royal Commission on the Defence of the United Kingdom in 1859. The Commission reported the following year and recommended that new, more powerful forts be built further downstream, with defences such as Tilbury Fort forming a second line of defence. Work began on strengthening Tilbury in 1868 under the direction of the then Captain Charles Gordon, focusing on adding heavier gun positions able to fire upstream to support the new forts. The west, northeast and east bastions and the southeast curtain wall were altered to house 13 rifle muzzle-loading guns protected by brick walls, earthworks and iron shields. Initially, 7-ton, 7-inch guns were deployed, but these were upgraded to 9-inch weapons by 1888, supported by a heavier 25-ton, 11-inch gun. The old Tudor blockhouse was destroyed to make way for the new guns. Naval and defensive technology continued to improve over the next few decades, rendering Tilbury Fort's bastion design outmoded. The government considered the defences further down the Thames to be sufficient, and Tilbury was therefore not improved. It was largely redundant as a defensive fortification by the end of the century, although still in use as a strategic depot. From 1889 onwards it formed a mobilisation centre to support a mobile strike force in the event of an invasion, part of the wider London Defence Scheme, and large storage buildings were built across the site to store material. Fresh concerns grew that the Thames might be vulnerable to attack from torpedo boats and armoured cruisers, and in 1903 4 quick-firing 12-pounder guns were positioned on Tilbury's southeast curtain wall, supplemented in 1904 by 2 6-inch breech-loading guns. In 1905, however, the government decided that the Royal Navy and the forts downstream gave sufficient protection for the capital and removed the artillery, leaving only machine guns in place. Tilbury continued to function as a mobilisation store, and after the outbreak of the First World War, it was used to house up to 300 transit soldiers and to supply the new army camps established at Purfleet and Bellas Mansion. It was initially manned by the 2nd Battalion of the Royal Dublin Fusiliers until 1916, and by various reserve units for the rest of the war. The fort itself was used to store munitions, while a depot for remounts was built just to the west. A pontoon bridge was built across the Thames for troop movements, guarded by the fort's guns. Until 1917, also used to house the headquarters of several infantry bastions. Electric lighting was installed, and a narrow gauge railway and a steam crane on the quay were added to help to move material in and out of the fort. After the Zeppelin raids of June 1915, anti-aircraft guns and searchlights were mounted at the fort, and they played a role in the shooting down of the German Navy Zeppelin L-15, although it is disputed as to which site in the area fired the shell that brought down the airship. During the interwar years, the government concluded that the fort was no longer militarily useful, and there were unsuccessful attempts to sell it off for development. During the Second World War, the fort initially housed an improvised anti-aircraft operations room, controlling the defences of the Thames and Medway North gun zone between 1939 and 1940. Trenches were dug across the surrounding area to prevent an airborne attack. The fort remains largely unaltered from its reconstruction in the late 17th century under the direction of Sir Bernard de Gaume, with some 19th century additions. It was designed in a predominantly Dutch style, with a ring of outer and inner defences intended to allow the fort to attack hostile warships while being protected from attack from the land. The outer defences comprise outer and inner water-filled moats, fed by the Thames and separated by a ring of defensive ramparts. The inner moat is 50 metres wide, but relatively shallow, and the banks have been repeatedly strengthened with piles to protect them from erosion. The fort is entered from the north through a triangular defensive work known as a redan, with a redoubt to defend the entrance. A causeway links the redan to the outer defences, which form a complex pattern of ramparts, protecting a covered way stretching around the defensive line. There are bastions on the northwest and northeast corners, and two triangular spurs, originally equipped with cannons, project from the defences on the west side and east sides, with assembly points for infantry soldiers on the inside. A replica wooden bridge runs from the outer defences over the water to an island called a ravelin, which is in turn linked to the inner defences by another replica bridge protected with two drawbridges. The ravelin formed a physical barrier to incoming artillery fire aimed at the entrance to the inner defences, and could also have directed fire against enemy forces that breached the outer defensive line. On the south side of the outer defences, facing the river, are the west and east lines of gun positions. These were built in the 18th century and have been subject to considerable erosion and silting. 12 of the original 14 gun positions on the west line remain, but only one of the east line has survived. In between the lines is a quay designed to allow the delivery of supplies from the Thames, and the remains of the tracks from a narrow gauge railway built during the First World War. A sluice gate in the southwest corner managed the water in the moats and allowed them to be drained completely should the surfaces begin to freeze over in winter, and provide an advantage to any attackers. Moving east from the Watergate, the south-eastern curtain defences and the south-east bastion were rebuilt at the start of the 20th century to hold emplacements for 4 quick-firing guns and 2 6-inch guns, with underground tunnels linking it to an underground magazine. 4 artillery pieces dating from 1898 to 1942 are on display. The fort became increasingly less significant as a defensive structure, however, as military technology developed in the 19th century. It was redeveloped to hold heavy artillery after 1868, providing a second line of defence along the river, but further changes in technology meant that it had become more obsolete by the end of the century. Instead, Tilbury became a strategic depot, forming a logistical hub for storing and moving troops and material throughout the First World War. The fort had only a limited role in the Second World War and was demobilised in 1950. The 17th century defences are considered by the historian Paul Patterson to be the best surviving example of their kind in Britain, and the fort includes the only surviving early 18th century gunpowder magazines in Britain. The enlisted barracks and the facilities block, as well as probably the sutler's house, were bombed and damaged, being demolished after the war. The fort was transferred out of military use relatively early in the post-war period, and in 1950 the Ministry of Works took over the site. Restoration work took place in the 1970s, including the construction of replica wooden bridges. It was opened to the public in 1982